that lady, and I don't know how she's done it all. Bill Murphy, our chairman, asked me to remark for a few minutes on what we are here to do at this conference. We are here to show you that far from being a quaint antique, gold remains central to the world economic system. The United States military, when it packs the emergency kits of its fighter pilots, does not pack them with US dollars or euros or yuan or yen or any of the paper currencies. It packs them with these little things, 100-year-old quarter-ounce British sovereigns, gold coins. Why is that? That's because at all times and in all circumstances, this remains money. That is one of the premises of our organization, and it really is I think the key to understanding what is really going on with gold. We are also here to show you that far from being a speculation that is interesting at best and paranoid at worst, the suppression of the gold price by Western central banks is actually a matter of public record. I wanted to go over a few things about that public record, which, public as it is really not perceived, partly because I think the press just doesn't look at it because GATA doesn't do a lot of advertising, JP Morgan does. How do we know that the central banks are working with bullion banks and other financial houses to suppress the price of gold? We know because of the painstaking research of our consultants, Reg Howe, James Turk, Andrew Hepburn, Mike Bolser, Bob Landis, among others. They've gone through the official reports and the footnotes, the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury Department, central banks and government agencies, mining companies and financial houses, and they have amassed enormous evidence, much of which we've posted at our internet site, gata.org. But that's the complicated stuff. We also know that the central banks have been rigging the gold price for a very simple reason. That is, we know because they and their intermediaries working to suppress the price time and again have told us so. After all, what was the Washington Agreement of September 1999 if not a proclamation of the 15 participating central banks that they were colluding to regulate the gold price? Of course, in the Washington Agreement, the central banks affected to be supporting the gold price. They pledged to limit their gold sales to 400 tons per year for 5 years, lest, they said, the gold market be flooded with metal and the gold price collapse, taking with it the economies of the gold-producing countries. Of course, GATA has put a different construction on the Washington Agreement. We consider it the device by which central bank gold loans are written off as sales at discounted prices, rather than be called back and cause a short squeeze in gold. That is, far from supporting the price, the Washington Agreement was how the central banks kept gold from rising and prevented the bankruptcy of the financial houses that, at the invitation of the central banks, eagerly joined the gold carry trade of the 1990s. In that gold carry trade, gold was, in effect, loaned by the central banks for next to nothing and sold by the financial houses to depress its price, strengthen the US dollar, reduce interest rates, and inflate the price of paper assets, which were purchased with the proceeds of the gold sales. But no matter how you want to construe it, the Washington Agreement was admittedly a coordinated action by the central banks to regulate the gold price. That central banks get together to discuss and unify their policy toward gold, a competitive currency, is a matter of ordinary public record. Anyone who really believes that this collusion is always benign, always in the public interest, and always without ulterior motives shouldn't go even grocery shopping alone. The Washington Agreement wasn't the first coordinated intervention of the central banks in regard to gold. It was at least the second and probably much more belated than that. How do we know? Because Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan told us. In fact, he told Congress too. As usual, no one in the financial press seems to have been paying attention. But on July 24th, 1998, Greenspan told the House Banking Committee, quote, "Central banks stand ready to lease gold in increasing quantities should the price rise," unquote. He repeated that statement a few days later to the Senate Agriculture Committee. Of course, like the central banks that participated in the Washington Agreement, Greenspan was disguising the true purposes of the policy he described. He was explaining why he didn't think that the derivatives market needed federal regulation and suggested that central bank gold leasing was a safeguard against a private corner on the gold market, a safeguard that made derivatives regulation unnecessary. Gata maintains that, as with the Washington Agreement, the purposes of the central banks were the opposite of what Greenspan was suggesting. Far from working together to prevent a private corner on the gold market, the central banks were using gold leasing to maintain a corner on the gold market themselves. Construe Greenspan's testimony as you will, but there it is again, central banks admitting that they worked together to regulate the price of gold. And more than that, Greenspan told Congress, if inadvertently, that the purpose of gold leasing was not really the purpose long maintained by the central banks involved in it, to extract a little income from a supposedly dead asset, but rather to keep the gold price down. Central bankers are not the only ones in the gold business who acknowledge collusion to control the gold price. The biggest hedger among the gold mining companies, Barrick Gold, has gone so far as to confess in federal court in New Orleans to participation in this scheme. Sued along with its bullion bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, by Blanchard and Company, the New Orleans coin and bullion dealer, Barrick filed a surprisingly candid motion in court on February 28, 2003. Barrick moved for dismissal of Blanchard's lawsuit on grounds of sovereign immunity. That is, Barrick claimed that in borrowing gold from central banks through Morgan Chase, Barrick became the agent for central bank gold policy. That as the agent of central banks, the company could not properly be sued without suing the real parties in interest, the central banks, as well. And that since the central banks, as the agencies of sovereign governments, have immunity and could not be made party to the Blanchard suit, the whole suit should be dismissed. That motion has been copied and remains posted at the Gata internet site. We call it Barrick's Confession. Fortunately, the judge in the Blanchard case, Judge Helen Berrigan, dismissed Barrick's motion to dismiss on grounds of sovereign immunity, and so Blanchard's lawsuit has gone to the evidence collecting phase. The suit is similar to Reg Howe's federal lawsuit, which was brought in U.S. District Court in Boston, underwritten financially by Gata, included government defendants, and failed on the very issue of sovereign immunity, the issue that is now out of the way, so that in the Blanchard case, the world yet might have a chance of getting a close look at how the gold market really works. Just as the true purpose of gold leasing is to suppress the gold price rather than earn a little interest on a supposedly dead asset, some central banks even acknowledge that the only purpose of holding gold reserves at all now, in the absence of any currency's formal convertibility, is to rig markets. This is recorded in the annual report for 2003 from the Reserve Bank of Australia. Foreign currency reserve assets in gold are held primarily to support intervention in the foreign exchange market. And you can still read that on the Reserve Bank of Australia's internet site. All this shows that while the formal convertibility of currencies into gold has been ended by the Articles of the International Monetary Fund, gold continues in its nature and function as money and as the independent international currency, the competitor of the dollar and the euro and everything else, and that central banks recognize as much, however grudgingly. Central banks often acknowledge intervention in the currency markets. Direct intervention, as with the Bank of Japan's printing yen to buy dollars and the People's Bank of China's enforcing a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. And indirect intervention is by the heavy purchases by many central banks of U.S. government bonds. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve intervenes in and supports the U.S. bond and equity markets every week through the strategic purchase and sale of U.S. government bonds. Maybe you've heard the joke about the lawyer who, asked by a potential client, "How much is 2 and 2?" replied, "How much do you want it to be?" These days, that is even more the premise of central banking than of the practice of law. What do the markets say? Well, what do the central banks want them to say? Far from being the mechanisms of steady development and democracy we tout to the developing world, markets now, in the eyes of central banking, are considered to be usually inefficient and wrong. And so bailouts and interventions and the issuance of price-capping derivatives have followed constantly on each other's heels so that no big financial interest might ever suffer the consequences of its mistakes or venality. National and even world economic objectives are now set by unelected overlords, gods of the market, whose power is almost completely undemocratic. Amid all this intervention, why should it be so hard to accept that central banks might be more involved in the gold market than they make plain? Indeed, to believe that the central banks are not deeply involved in the gold market, one almost has to believe that it is only the gold market they are not deeply involved in. GATA is in the free market advocacy business, not the investment advice business. But we can draw a few conclusions. First, because of gold leasing and the deceptive accounting for it, central bank gold reserves are far less than what is claimed. Second, amid worldwide currency debasement, the gold price will be largely a matter of how much more the central banks are ready to lease and then sell, a matter of how far down the central banks are willing to run their gold reserves and whether they think they may need gold again to restore confidence someday when currency debasement gets out of hand. And by the way, at 10 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, the gold price was $435.50. It was down $1.10 in spite of the strike that's drying up supply in South Africa. Silver was down 5 cents to $7.06, but that was a few hours ago. The evidence of the gold price of the last few years, rising steadily despite constant selling or talk of selling by the central banks, suggests that the central banks are attempting a controlled retreat with gold. The increase in official anti-gold propaganda supports suspicion that the central banks are running out of golden ammunition. And third, and most important, far from being Keynes's barbarous relic or a quaint antique, gold remains not just basic to the world economic system, but in fact the secret knowledge of the universe, the substance and mechanism by which everything else financial can be revealed and measured. If gold ever escapes the distortions that so laboriously have been imposed on it, we may see how everything we have considered normal has actually been distorted grotesquely. May see to our shock that, as Kipling wrote in The Gods of the Copybook Headings, all is not gold that glitters, and 2 and 2 make 4. When that day comes and the real world reasserts itself with a vengeance, people will need the real thing, or the real things, anything that is real. Kipling foresaw it this way. Then the gods of the market tumbled, and their smooth-tongued wizards withdrew, and the hearts of the meanest were humbled, and began to believe it was true, that all is not gold that glitters, and 2 and 2 make 4. And the gods of the copybook headings limped up to explain it once more. As it will be in the future, it was at the birth of man. There are only 4 things certain since social progress began: that the dog returns to his vomit, and the sow returns to her mire, and the bird fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire, and that after this is accomplished, and the brave new world begins, when all men are paid for existing and no man must pay for his sins, as surely as water will wet us, as surely as fire will burn, the gods of the copybook headings with terror and slaughter return. Well, we hope we can avoid that apocalyptic conclusion, and I think we will discuss here today some things that we possibly can do to put gold and silver to work to really save the economic system and bring a little restraint and justice to the world. We have some people who here today who are going to speak at this conference who have some solutions. James Turk, who founded Gold Money, is probably the most dangerous man in the world today in regard to the financial establishment. He has found a way of putting gold to work in commerce in ordinary, convenient daily transactions. You'll hear from him. Hugo Salinas Price from Mexico, one of the great thinkers in the world when it comes to economic matters, has a plan which I think has a decent chance of enactment in Mexico to reintroduce silver as a parallel official currency in that country. Mexico being, like South Africa, another rich country that insists on being poor. John Reesing from Milestone Capital and the Producers Gold Exchange is here, and while he's not formally scheduled to speak, he has an idea that he's been pushing for a few years about creating a competitive gold exchange apart from the COMEX, having the gold producers found that. He and Alan Marder of Golden Star, who was here, have discussed that. John, could you stand up for a second wherever you are? I can't see from up here. John is right here. I invite anybody connected with the industry to see John and talk to him about that idea. Lastly, we would like your ideas for growing this organization. We have operated for 6.5 years on a shoestring. I did some research into our tax returns last week. We've raised, I think, over 6.5 years, about $700,000 and spent about $600,000. I think we've struck a few pretty good blows in that time with very limited funds. By contrast, the budget of the World Gold Council is $62 million a year. I think if we had 10% of that, we could have this problem solved by next week. Failing some ideas, Murphy and I may have to strap ourselves with gold nuggets and detonate ourselves in front of the Fed and the Treasury. And I've got a family and I'd prefer it didn't come to that. So we will be soliciting your ideas for what we can do, how we can grow, and how we can do more damage to the bad guys. Now I'm going to introduce our first real speaker, who is my partner, my colleague, my friend, my hero, Bill Murphy. This whole organization got started because I sent him a note that basically said, "Hey, Bill, let's you and them fight." And he took me up on that. I'm not going to go into the biographies of the speakers very much. I don't want to cut into people's times. You've got them in your program. I encourage you to read them. Bill, my friend.